Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Mr. Bell. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off, I thought it would be a fun idea if everyone can leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also, like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I don't even know where to start with this. I've been trying to figure out a way to talk about what happened for days now, but every time I sit down to type, it feels like my thoughts get scrambled. I'm not good at writing or telling stories, but I need to get this out, so I'll just try to tell it the best I can. My name is James, and what I'm about to tell you happened when I was 17. It started on a Saturday afternoon when my parents, Robert and Linda, were away for the weekend visiting my aunt in Chicago. They'd left Friday morning, kissing me goodbye and reminding me about the emergency numbers stuck to the refrigerator with the strawberry magnet my mom had bought years ago. It wasn't the first time they'd left me home alone, but something about this time felt different. I can't say why, I just had a weird feeling that kept nagging at the back of my mind, like when you feel like someone's watching you but you can't see anyone there. The house seemed to breathe differently when they were gone, the walls creaking in unfamiliar rhythms, the floorboards settling with sounds I'd never noticed before. I'd gotten used to being alone in the house by now, so I wasn't worried about it. I was just doing my usual thing, playing video games in the living room with the curtains drawn, watching TV with the volume turned up louder than my parents would normally allow, and enjoying the silence that came with not having to make conversation over dinner. But the silence wasn't really silent, was it? That's what I kept thinking as the day wore on. The refrigerator hummed with a mechanical wheeze that seemed louder than usual. The old grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with a hollow, echoing sound that seemed to bounce off the walls and come back slightly delayed. Every time the house settled, and old houses do that constantly, it sounded like footsteps on the floor above me, even though I knew I was alone. The house felt too quiet, but I figured that was just because I wasn't used to being by myself for that long. My parents had left around noon on Friday, and by Saturday afternoon, I'd been alone for over 24 hours. The longest stretch I'd ever had the house to myself. The refrigerator was well stocked with leftover pizza and sandwich ingredients, and my mom had left a $20 bill on the kitchen counter for emergencies, though I couldn't imagine what emergency might require exactly $20. Around 4 p.m. I decided to take a shower. I'd been inside all day, sprawled on the couch in the same clothes I'd worn to bed, and I felt gross from sitting around in the stagnant air of the house. The bathroom is at the end of the hall, right by my parents' bedroom, and I remember thinking how nice it would be to just relax under the hot water for a while, to wash away the sticky feeling of being cooped up indoors. As I walked down the hall, my bare feet making soft slapping sounds on the hardwood floor, I noticed how dark it was. The afternoon sun was filtering through the windows, but it seemed muted, almost gray, casting long shadows that stretched across the walls in ways I'd never paid attention to before. My parents' bedroom door was slightly ajar, and through the crack I could see the unmade bed, the rumpled sheets looking somehow ominous in the dim light. I locked the bathroom door behind me, just like I always do, and turned on the shower. The pipes groaned and shuddered as the water started flowing. Our house was old, built in the 1960s, and the plumbing had always been temperamental. The sound echoed through the walls, a deep thrumming that seemed to vibrate through the floor and into my bones. I'm sure I didn't hear anything out of the ordinary while I was in there. The water was running at full pressure, creating a constant white noise that filled the small bathroom. The fan was on, whirring loudly as it struggled to keep up with the steam that quickly started fogging up the mirror. The whole room filled with warm, humid air that made my skin feel slick and made breathing feel thick and heavy. I don't know how long I was in there. Time has a way of stretching when you're alone, when there's no one around to remind you of schedules or responsibilities. I wasn't keeping track of time. I just let the hot water run over me, washing away the grime and the strange anxiety that had been building in my chest since yesterday. But eventually, the hot water started to run cold, another charming feature of our old house. and I turned off the taps. The sudden silence after the constant noise of running water was jarring. I could hear my own breathing, the sound of water dripping from my hair onto the tile floor, the faint hum of the bathroom fan as it continued to circulate the humid air. I stepped out of the shower, the cold air hitting my wet skin and raising goosebumps along my arms and legs. I grabbed a towel from the rack, a blue one that smelled like the lavender fabric softener my mom used, and started drying off, starting with my hair and working my way down. That's when I looked up at the mirror. The steam from the shower had fogged it up completely, turning the reflective surface into a cloud of white condensation. This was normal. It happened every time someone took a hot shower in our old bathroom. The fan wasn't powerful enough to keep up with the steam, and it usually took 10 or 15 minutes for the fog to clear completely. I remember wiping the fog off the mirror with my hand, just like I always do. I made a small clear circle right in the center, just enough to see my face as I brushed my teeth or combed my hair. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just leftover steam, maybe a smudge or something from when I'd wiped the mirror. But when I looked closer, really focused on what I was seeing, I saw the word "hello" written in the fog. It wasn't there before, I swear. I would have noticed it if it was, but now it was clear as day, right in front of me, written in a clean, perfect script that looked like someone had carefully traced each letter with their finger. The letters were precise, deliberate. Not the kind of accidental marks you might get from randomly touching a steamy mirror. Each letter was perfectly formed, with clean lines and curves that spoke of intention, of someone taking their time to make sure the message was legible. The H had a perfect loop, the double L was evenly spaced, and the O was a complete round circle. I froze. My heart stopped beating for what felt like a full second, then started up again with a rapid, panicked rhythm that I could feel in my throat. It wasn't like I thought someone was playing a joke on me. There was no one else in the house. No way someone could have gotten in without me knowing. But my heart started pounding anyway, a deep, hard thumping that seemed to echo the sound of the grandfather clock downstairs. I felt my stomach turn, like I was suddenly hit with a wave of panic, the kind you feel when you're walking alone at night and hear footsteps behind you that match your pace exactly. My skin went cold, despite the warm, humid air of the bathroom, and I could feel sweat starting to form on my palms even though I just dried them with the towel. My first instinct was to check the door. Maybe I hadn't locked it properly and someone had snuck in while I was showering, while the water was running and I couldn't hear anything else. But no, the door was still locked. I checked it twice, turning the handle and finding it firmly secured, and the rest of the house was still quiet except for the familiar sounds I'd been hearing all day. The refrigerator humming, the clock ticking, the house settling with those creaking, groaning sounds that old houses make. But now those sounds seemed different, more ominous. Every creak of the floorboards sounded like someone walking through the house. Every shift and settling of the old wooden beams sounded deliberate, purposeful, as if the house itself was moving around me. I stood there staring at the mirror for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself that I had just missed it earlier, that maybe it was there the whole time and I simply hadn't noticed. Maybe someone, maybe I, had accidentally written it earlier and forgotten. But no matter how hard I tried to rationalize it, it didn't make sense. I had been the only one in the house. No one else had been there. And I definitely hadn't written anything on the mirror. The bathroom felt smaller now, the walls seeming to close in around me. The fog on the mirror was starting to dissipate around the edges, but the word, "hello," remained clear and distinct, as if the letters were etched more deeply than the surrounding condensation. I could feel my heart racing, and I realized I was holding my breath, as if making any sound might attract the attention of whoever had left the message. My skin felt hot and cold at the same time, and I could feel my heart racing in a way that made my vision slightly blurry around the edges. The towel around my waist felt loose and inadequate, like I was exposed and vulnerable in a way that had nothing to do with being naked. I didn't want to be alone anymore. I didn't want to be in this house, in this bathroom, looking at this impossible message that couldn't exist but clearly did. I thought about calling my parents, but I knew they'd think I was being paranoid. How could I explain what had happened without sounding insane? "Hello, Mom and Dad. I took a shower and someone wrote 'hello' on the bathroom mirror, but no one else is here." They'd tell me I was imagining things, Or maybe they'd worry that I was having some kind of breakdown, and they'd drive the 3 hours back from Chicago to check on me, and then I'd have to explain why I'd ruined their weekend over a word on a mirror. I didn't know what to do. I took a few slow steps back from the mirror, keeping my eyes fixed on the message. Afraid that if I looked away it might change, might become something else, something worse. And when I looked at the mirror again, I swear I saw the fog start to shift around the letters, like something was moving behind the glass, disturbing the condensation in ways that had nothing to do with air currents or temperature changes. The edges of the letters seemed to blur for a second, not disappearing, but becoming less distinct, as if someone was breathing on the other side of the mirror, their breath warming the glass and changing the pattern of the fog. I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the temperature of the bathroom, and every hair on the back of my neck stood up. That's when I grabbed my phone from the counter where I'd left it and texted my best friend Michael. My hands were shaking so badly I had to retype the message 3 times before I could send it. I didn't say much, just, "Something's wrong. I don't know what's going on, but I need you to come over." I didn't even know what I was asking him to do, but I didn't want to be in that house alone anymore. The message felt inadequate, too simple for what I was experiencing. But how do you text someone about an impossible word on a bathroom mirror? How do you explain the feeling that someone else is in your house when you know, absolutely know, that you're alone? While I was waiting for him to text back, I stared at the fog on the mirror again. The word was still there, just hanging in the air like a bad omen, like a promise of something terrible yet to come. I couldn't stop thinking about how I had been alone in the house, and yet someone, or something, had written on the mirror. I couldn't explain it, couldn't rationalize it away, and that inability to understand what was happening was almost worse than the message itself. It felt like the walls were closing in around me, like the bathroom was shrinking, becoming a trap instead of a refuge. The word hello seemed to pulse slightly in my peripheral vision, though when I looked directly at it, it remained static, unchanged, impossible. A few minutes later, I heard the front door open and close. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat, thinking maybe my parents had come back early. But when I threw on a t-shirt and jeans and ran to the hallway, looking down over the banister, I saw Michael standing at the bottom of the stairs. He was looking up at me with a confused expression, his car keys still in his hand, like he wasn't sure what was going on, but had come anyway because that's the kind of friend Michael was. He'd driven the 10 minutes from his house without asking questions, without demanding explanations, just showing up because I'd asked him to. "What's going on?" he asked, and I could hear the concern in his voice. Michael was the kind of person who could usually read a situation immediately, but standing there in our front hallway, he looked genuinely puzzled by whatever he was seeing in my face. I could barely say anything at first. How do you explain something that doesn't make sense? Something that shouldn't be possible? I just pointed toward the bathroom, too shaken to speak clearly. My voice, when it finally came out, sounded strange and foreign to my own ears. "In the bathroom," I managed to say. There's something on the mirror." He gave me a strange look, the kind of look you give someone when you're starting to worry about their mental state. But he followed me up the stairs anyway. His footsteps on the wooden steps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing through the house in a way that made me acutely aware of how empty and quiet everything was. When we reached the bathroom, Michael stopped in the doorway, and I watched his face change as he saw the mirror. The fog had started to dissipate around the edges, but the word hello was still there, clear as day, written in perfect script across the center of the glass. He immediately started laughing, but it was a nervous laugh. The kind of sound people make when they don't know how to react to something that doesn't fit their understanding of the world. It was the laugh of someone trying to convince themselves that what they're seeing has a rational explanation. "Dude," he said, stepping closer to the mirror, "this is some seriously creepy stuff. But it's probably just, you were just in here, right? Maybe you wrote it and forgot?" I could tell he was trying to rationalize it, trying to find some logical explanation, but I could also see in his eyes that he was disturbed by what he was seeing. Michael was a practical person, someone who believed in cause and effect, in logical explanations for everything. But standing there looking at that mirror, he looked as unsettled as I felt. "It wasn't there before," I said, and my voice sounded more desperate than I wanted it to. "I swear, Michael, it just appeared. I was drying off, and when I looked up, it was there." He went to wipe the fog off the mirror, but I grabbed his arm to stop him. No, don't, I said. It wasn't there before, I swear, it just appeared. He looked at me like I was crazy, but I could tell he wasn't entirely sure what to think. After a few seconds, he shrugged and stepped back from the mirror. Maybe it's just leftover steam, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. I mean, you were just in there, right? Maybe someone wrote it earlier and it only showed up when the mirror got fogged. But it didn't feel like that to me. The way the word was written, the way it seemed to appear when no one else was around, it didn't feel normal. Something wasn't right, and I could see that Michael felt it too, even if he was trying to be rational about it. Look at the letters, I said, pointing at the mirror. Look how perfect they are. That's not accidental. Someone took time to write that. Michael leaned closer, studying the script, and I saw his expression change. The letters were indeed perfect, too perfect for someone to have written quickly or accidentally. Each character was carefully formed, with consistent pressure and spacing that spoke of deliberate intent. We both stared at the mirror for a few more seconds, and I noticed that the fog around the word was behaving strangely. While the condensation on the rest of the mirror was gradually evaporating, the area around the letters seemed to maintain its opacity, as if something was keeping that particular section moist and visible. This is really weird, James, Michael said quietly, and for the first time since he'd arrived, I heard genuine unease in his voice. How long has it been there? I saw it right after I got out of the shower, maybe 10 minutes ago. As we stood there, I became aware of other sounds in the house that I hadn't noticed before. The refrigerator's hum seemed to have developed a rhythm, almost like breathing. The grandfather clock's ticking seemed slower, more deliberate, as if it was counting down to something rather than simply marking time. And then, from somewhere in the house, we heard a sound that made both of us freeze. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The sound of a floorboard creaking downstairs, as if someone was walking slowly through our living room. Michael and I looked at each other, and I saw my own fear reflected in his eyes. Did you hear that? He whispered. I nodded, unable to speak. We listened intently, and after a moment we heard it again. Another creak coming from the direction of the front door, as if someone was moving carefully through the house, trying not to be heard. Maybe it's just the house settling, Michael said, but his voice was barely above a whisper, and I could tell he didn't believe his own words. Houses don't settle in patterns, I replied, because the creaking sounds were too regular, too purposeful to be random structural movements. We crept to the bathroom doorway and peered down the hall toward the stairs. From our vantage point, we couldn't see the front door or the living room, but we could hear the sounds more clearly now, soft, deliberate footsteps moving across the hardwood floor downstairs. Someone's in your house, Michael said, and the reality of those words hit me like a physical blow. I thought about the locked doors, the security of our house, the fact that I'd been alone for over a day, but someone was definitely moving around downstairs and they were trying to be quiet about it, which made it infinitely more terrifying than if they'd simply announced their presence. What do we do? I asked, my voice barely audible. Call the police, Michael said, pulling out his phone. But before he could dial, we heard something that made both of us step back into the bathroom. The sound of someone climbing the stairs, slowly and deliberately, each step careful and measured. We looked at each other in panic. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The bathroom window was too small to climb through, and we were trapped at the end of the hallway with whoever was coming up the stairs between us and any possible escape route. I turned to look at the mirror one more time, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. The word hello was still there, but now, written underneath it in the same perfect script, was a new message. We've been waiting. Michael saw it too, and I watched the color drain from his face. James, he said, his voice trembling. We need to get out of here. Now. But as we turned toward the door, we heard the footsteps reach the top of the stairs and then stop. Whoever was in our house was now standing in the hallway, just outside the bathroom door, and in the complete silence that followed, I could swear I heard the sound of someone breathing, slow and steady, just on the other side of the door. The breathing was wrong somehow. Too controlled, too deliberate. As if whoever was out there was listening as intently as we were, waiting for us to make a move, waiting for us to give away our position. I looked at Michael, and in his eyes I saw the same terrible understanding that was dawning on me. We weren't alone in the house, and whoever was out there had been waiting for us, had been expecting us, had perhaps even orchestrated this entire situation from the beginning. The word hello on the mirror wasn't just a message. It was an invitation, a greeting from someone who had been watching, who had been planning, who had been waiting for exactly this moment. And now, they were here. The breathing outside the bathroom door continued for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Michael and I stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to make any sound that might let whoever was out there know exactly where we were in the small bathroom. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. We heard footsteps moving away from the door, back down the hallway. But instead of going down the stairs, they seemed to be heading toward my parents' bedroom. Michael grabbed my arm and pointed toward the door, mouthing the word "run" silently. I nodded, and we moved as quietly as we could toward the bathroom door. I slowly turned the handle, grateful that the door didn't creak as it opened. We crept out into the hallway, and I could see that my parents' bedroom door, which had been slightly ajar when I'd walked past it earlier, was now wide open. The room beyond was dark, but I could make out the shape of someone standing next to my parents' bed, perfectly still, as if they were examining something. Michael tugged on my sleeve, pulling me toward the stairs, and we made our way down as carefully as we could. Every step seemed to echo through the house, and I was certain that whoever was upstairs would hear us and come after us. But we made it to the bottom of the stairs without incident, and Michael immediately headed for the front door. That's when we heard a knock. The sound came from the front door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks that echoed through the house. Michael and I looked at each other in confusion and terror. If someone was upstairs in my parents' bedroom, who was at the front door? I peered through the peephole and saw a man standing on our front porch. He was tall and thin, wearing dark clothes, and he was standing perfectly still, staring directly at the door as if he could see me looking back at him. His face was pale and gaunt, with deep-set eyes that seemed to reflect what little light was available from our porch lamp. There was something wrong with his stillness. People don't stand that still, not naturally. It was as if he was a statue, or a mannequin, positioned on our porch and waiting for us to notice him. I stepped back from the door and whispered to Michael, "There's someone out there." "Who is it?" he asked. "I don't know. I've never seen him before." The man knocked again, the same 3 slow, deliberate knocks, and this time I noticed that the sound seemed to echo strangely, as if it was coming from multiple directions at once. "Don't open it," Michael said, and I could hear the fear in his voice. We stood there, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. The man never called out, never identified himself, never asked if anyone was home. He just stood there, knocking occasionally, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, Michael pulled out his phone and called 911. I could hear him talking to the dispatcher, explaining that there were intruders in and around our house, giving our address, asking for police to come immediately. While he was on the phone, I looked through the peephole again. The man was still there, still standing in that unnatural stillness, but now he was looking directly at the peephole, as if he knew I was watching him. His eyes seemed to bore into me through the small lens, and I stepped back quickly, my heart pounding. "They're sending officers," Michael said after he hung up. "They should be here in a few minutes." But as soon as he said that, we heard the footsteps upstairs again, moving back toward the staircase. Whoever had been in my parents' bedroom was coming back down, and we were trapped between them and the man on the front porch. "Back door," I whispered, and we headed toward the kitchen. But as we passed through the living room, I caught a glimpse of something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Through the window I could see our backyard, and there was someone standing there too. Another figure, just as still and unnatural as the man on the front porch, positioned near our back door. "Michael," I said, grabbing his arm, "look." He followed my gaze and saw the figure in the backyard. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "How many of them are there?" As if in answer to his question, I looked toward the living room window that faced the side of our house, and there was another figure there, standing in our neighbor's yard, but clearly watching our house. We were surrounded. The footsteps upstairs had reached the main floor now, and we could hear someone moving through the dining room toward the kitchen. We were being herded, pushed into a smaller and smaller space with no way out. "The basement," I said, and we headed for the basement door in the kitchen. I pulled the door open, and we rushed down the stairs into the darkness below. I fumbled for the light switch and flicked it on, illuminating our unfinished basement with its concrete floor and exposed ceiling beams. We could hear movement upstairs now, multiple sets of footsteps walking through our house with no attempt at concealment. It sounded like they were searching for something or someone. Us. "How did they get in?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't have an answer. I'd checked all the doors and windows before my parents left. Everything had been locked up tight. But somehow, these people had gotten into our house, and they seemed to know exactly where we were at all times. We heard the basement door open above us, and footsteps began descending the wooden stairs. I looked around frantically for somewhere to hide, but the basement was mostly empty. Just my dad's workbench, some storage boxes, and the furnace. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, and I saw a pair of legs come into view. They were wearing dark pants and black shoes, and they moved with the same unnatural stillness I'd observed in the man on the front porch. Michael grabbed my arm and pulled me behind the furnace, and we crouched there in the shadows, trying to stay out of sight. Through the gap between the furnace and the wall, I could see the person who had come downstairs. It was a woman, tall and thin like the man on the porch, with the same pale skin and deep-set eyes. She was wearing a dark dress that seemed to absorb the light around her, and she moved through the basement with purpose, as if she was looking for something specific. She walked slowly around the perimeter of the room, her movements deliberate and searching. When she reached the area near the workbench, she stopped and tilted her head, as if she was listening for something. That's when I realized she was listening for us. Our breathing, our heartbeats, any sound that might give away our location. I held my breath and tried to remain perfectly still, but I could feel my heart pounding so hard I was certain she would hear it. Next to me, Michael was doing the same, his body tense and motionless. The woman continued her search, moving closer and closer to our hiding spot behind the furnace. Just as I was certain she would find us, we heard the sound of sirens approaching from outside. The woman's head snapped up toward the ceiling, and for a moment she stood perfectly still, listening to the approaching police cars. Then, without any warning or explanation, she turned and walked back up the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the basement. We waited until we heard the basement door close before we emerged from our hiding spot. The sirens were getting louder, and I could see flashing red and blue lights through the small basement windows. "Come on," I said, and we headed back up the stairs. When we reached the main floor, the house was empty. No sign of the woman who had been in the basement. No indication that anyone had been upstairs searching through my parents' bedroom. It was as if they had simply vanished. We went to the front door and looked through the peephole. The man who had been standing on our porch was gone. I checked the back door, and the figure in our backyard had disappeared as well. By the time the police arrived and we let them in, there was no evidence that anyone had been in or around our house. No sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, no indication that anything unusual had happened at all. Except for the word "hello" still visible on the bathroom mirror, and underneath it, the message that had appeared while Michael and I were hiding. "We've been waiting." But when Officer Williams, the policeman who responded to our call, went upstairs to look at the mirror, both messages had vanished, leaving only a few faint streaks in the dissipating fog that could have been anything. "Are you boys sure about what you saw?" he asked, and I could hear the skepticism in his voice. We tried to explain, but without any physical evidence, our story sounded increasingly unbelievable even to ourselves. Two teenagers, home alone, claiming that multiple intruders had surrounded their house and somehow disappeared without a trace. Officer Williams took our statements, checked all the doors and windows, and walked through the house looking for any signs of disturbance. He found nothing. "Sometimes when you're nervous or scared," he said before leaving, "your imagination can play tricks on you. Old houses make a lot of noise, and it's easy to misinterpret sounds when you're alone." But I knew what we had seen and heard. The figures surrounding our house, the woman in the basement, the messages on the mirror. None of it was our imagination. After the police left, Michael stayed with me until my parents came home Sunday evening. We didn't talk much about what had happened, but I could see in his eyes that he was as shaken as I was by the experience. My parents listened to our story with the same skepticism Officer Williams had shown, chalking it up to teenage anxiety and overactive imaginations. They increased the security system, changed the locks, and made sure all the windows had proper latches, but I could tell they thought we had simply spooked ourselves. That was 3 weeks ago, and since then, nothing strange has happened. No mysterious messages, no unexpected visitors, no sounds in the night that can't be explained, but I still think about that word on the mirror and the message that appeared underneath it. We've been waiting. Waiting for what? And more importantly, are they still waiting? 3 weeks passed in relative normalcy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed in our house. The rooms felt different, as if they were holding secrets in their shadows. Every night I found myself checking and rechecking the locks on the doors and windows, running my fingers along the latches to make sure they were secure. My parents, Robert and Linda, had returned from Chicago that Sunday evening to find Michael and me sitting in the living room with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. They listened to our story with patient expressions that barely concealed their disbelief, nodding at appropriate intervals and asking questions that sounded supportive, but felt like they were trying to poke holes in our account. Times when we're alone for extended periods, my mother had said, using her gentle voice that she reserved for times when she thought I was being irrational, our minds can create scenarios that feel very real, but aren't necessarily based in reality. My father had been more direct. Old houses make noise, son. Pipes settle, wood expands and contracts, and when you're already on edge, those sounds can seem like something they're not. But they took precautions anyway. New locks were installed on all the doors, the security system was upgraded with motion sensors and cameras, and they made sure I had their cell phone numbers programmed into my phone with instructions to call immediately if anything unusual happened. Michael came over regularly during those 3 weeks, and we spent hours going over what we had experienced, trying to make sense of it. In daylight, surrounded by the normal sounds and activities of daily life, our story seemed less credible even to us. Had we really seen multiple figures surrounding the house? Had messages really appeared and disappeared on the bathroom mirror? The more time passed, the more our memories felt like fragments of a particularly vivid nightmare. But I continued to avoid the bathroom mirror when it was fogged with steam, and Michael admitted that he'd been having trouble sleeping, waking up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone was watching him. Then, on a Tuesday evening in early November, something happened that brought all our fears rushing back with renewed intensity. I was in my room doing homework when I heard my mother calling from downstairs. "James, can you come here for a minute?" I found her in the kitchen, standing by the window that faced our backyard, with a concerned expression on her face. "There's a man in the Hendersons' yard," she said, pointing through the glass. "He's just standing there, and he's been there for about 10 minutes. I'm starting to wonder if he's okay." I looked out the window, and my blood turned to ice. Standing in our neighbor's yard, partially hidden behind their garden shed, was a tall, thin figure in dark clothes. Even from a distance, even in the dim light of early evening, I recognized him immediately. It was the same man who had stood on our front porch 3 weeks ago. He was positioned so that he had a clear view of our house, and he was standing with that same unnatural stillness I remembered so vividly. Not swaying or shifting his weight like people normally do when they're standing in one place for extended periods, but perfectly motionless, like a mannequin or a scarecrow. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to call the police." "Why? He's not on our property. Maybe he's just—" "Mom, that's the man we told you about. The one who was on our porch." She looked at me with surprise, then back out the window at the figure in the Hendersons' yard. I could see her expression changing as she studied him more carefully, taking in his unnatural posture and the way he seemed to be focused intently on our house. "Are you sure?" she asked, but I could hear the concern growing in her voice. "I'm positive. Call Dad and call the police." She reached for her phone, but as she did, the figure in the yard began to move. He walked slowly toward the back of the Hendersons' property, disappearing behind their house with the same deliberate, measured pace I remembered from that night 3 weeks ago. My mother tried calling the police, but when they arrived 20 minutes later, there was no sign of anyone in the Hendersons' yard or anywhere else in the neighborhood. Officer Williams was the same policeman who had responded to our previous call, and I could see the skepticism in his eyes as he listened to our report. "Did you get a good look at his face?" he asked. No, it was too dark, and he was too far away, my mother admitted. But James says it was the same person from before. Officer Williams turned to me with an expression that was patient but clearly doubtful. Son, it's been 3 weeks since your previous incident. Are you certain this was the same individual? I knew how it sounded. A teenager claiming to recognize someone he'd glimpsed briefly through a peephole 3 weeks earlier, seen again at a distance in poor lighting conditions. But I was absolutely certain it was the same person. There was something distinctive about his posture, his movements, his presence that was unmistakable. It was him, I said firmly. I'm sure of it. Officer Williams nodded and made notes in his report, but I could tell he thought I was allowing my previous fears to color my perception of what was probably an innocent situation. After he left, my parents and I had a long conversation about what we should do. They were beginning to take my concerns more seriously, but they were also worried that I was developing an unhealthy fixation on what had happened 3 weeks ago. Maybe we should consider having you talk to someone, my mother suggested gently. Dr. Peterson has helped other teenagers work through anxiety and... I'm not imagining this, I said, cutting her off. Mom, you saw him too. You called the police. I saw someone in the Hendersons' yard, she said carefully. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was connected to what happened before, or that there's any reason for us to be concerned. But the next morning, Mrs. Henderson called to tell us that someone had broken into their garden shed overnight. Nothing had been stolen, but the lock had been cut, and several items had been moved around, as if someone had been searching for something. They went through all of my husband's tools, she told my mother over the phone. Didn't take anything, just moved things around. The police think it might be teenagers, but it gives me the creeps knowing someone was in our backyard. My mother looked at me with a new expression. Not quite belief, but not dismissal either. The break-in at the Henderson shed, combined with the figure I'd seen in their yard the previous evening, was too much of a coincidence to ignore. That afternoon, my father came home from work early and installed additional security measures around our property. Motion sensor lights went up around the perimeter of our yard, and he positioned security cameras to cover all the approaches to our house. I still think there's probably a rational explanation for all this, he told me as we tested the new equipment. But I'd rather err on the side of caution. That night, I lay in bed listening to every sound in the house, jumping at the normal settling noises that I'd been hearing my entire life, but which now seemed ominous and threatening. Around midnight, one of the new motion sensor lights in our backyard activated, flooding the area with bright white light. I went to my bedroom window and looked out, but I couldn't see anything that might have triggered the sensor. The yard appeared empty, bathed in the harsh, artificial light, with long shadows stretching across the grass from our trees and fence posts. But as I watched, I saw movement in the shadows at the edge of our property. Someone was standing just beyond the reach of our security lights, in the darkness between our yard and the woods behind our house. The figure was too far away and too well hidden for me to make out any details, but I could see enough to know that someone was there, watching our house. I called out to my parents, and by the time they reached my room, the figure had disappeared. The motion sensor light had shut off automatically, returning the backyard to darkness, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. I saw someone, I told them, in the woods, watching the house. My father went outside with a flashlight to investigate, but he found no footprints, no evidence that anyone had been on our property. The next morning, he reviewed the footage from our new security cameras, but they showed nothing unusual, just the motion light activating, apparently triggered by a small animal or a branch moving in the wind. But I knew what I had seen. Someone was watching our house. Someone who knew how to stay hidden, how to avoid the cameras and motion sensors, how to observe us without leaving any evidence of their presence. Over the next few days, I began to notice other things. Small changes in our yard. A garden gnome that had been facing one direction was now turned to face our house. A lawn chair that had been positioned differently, subtle signs that someone had been on our property when we weren't home. My parents saw these things too, but they attributed them to wind, animals, or their own imperfect memories of how things had been arranged. But I was paying attention now, documenting every change, every anomaly, and the pattern that emerged was clear. Someone was systematically studying our property, learning our routines, preparing for something. The realization that we were being watched, that every move we made was being observed and cataloged by an unknown presence, was more terrifying than any overt threat could have been. It was the slow, creeping horror of knowing that we were not safe in our own home, that the normal barriers of locks and walls and privacy meant nothing to whoever was focusing their attention on us. And I couldn't shake the feeling that this was all building toward something, that the watching and waiting was just preparation for whatever they had planned for us next. The answer came on a Thursday night in late November, almost 6 weeks after the initial incident with the mirror. I was in bed, reading for my American history class, when I heard a sound that made my blood freeze, the distinctive creak of our front door opening. I knew that creak intimately. It was the sound our old wooden door made when someone turned the handle and pushed it inward, a groaning protest from hinges that my father had been meaning to oil for months. But my parents were both asleep in their bedroom down the hall, and no one should have been able to open that door from the outside. My father had installed a new deadbolt just 2 weeks ago, a high-security lock that couldn't be picked easily or opened without the proper key. But as I lay there in the darkness, listening to the unmistakable sounds of someone moving quietly through our living room, I knew that somehow, someone had gotten inside. I reached for my phone to call 911, but as I did, my bedroom door slowly opened. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway, tall, thin, dressed in dark clothes that seemed to absorb the dim light from my bedside lamp. It was the same man I'd seen on our porch 6 weeks ago, the same figure my mother had spotted in the Hendersons' yard. But now, seeing him up close in the confined space of my bedroom, I could make out details that made the situation infinitely more terrifying. His face was wrong, not disfigured or monstrous, but wrong in a subtle way that made my brain struggle to process what I was seeing. His features were too symmetrical, too perfect, as if someone had designed them rather than grown them naturally. His skin had a waxy, artificial quality that reminded me of the mannequins in department store windows. But his eyes were the worst part. They were completely black, not dark brown or dark blue, but black, like looking into empty sockets. And they reflected light in a way that human eyes shouldn't, gleaming with an oily, iridescent sheen that shifted and moved as he tilted his head. He stepped into my room and closed the door behind him with deliberate care, and when he spoke, his voice had the same artificial quality as his appearance. Too perfect, too controlled, like a recording of human speech rather than the real thing. "Hello, James," he said, and I recognized the word that had appeared on our bathroom mirror 6 weeks ago. "We've been waiting to meet you properly." I tried to speak, to scream, to call for my parents, but my voice seemed to have abandoned me completely. The figure walked slowly around my room, examining my belongings with clinical interest, picking up books and photographs and studying them before setting them back down in slightly different positions. "You've been very observant," he continued, his voice maintaining that same unnatural modulation. "Most people don't notice us until it's much too late. But you saw us immediately, didn't you? You knew something was wrong from the very beginning." He stopped beside my desk and picked up a photograph of my family, a picture taken last Christmas, with my parents and me standing in front of our decorated tree. He studied it for a long moment, then looked at me with those horrible, reflecting eyes. "Your friend Michael saw us too," he said. "That was unexpected. Usually, only one person in a household is sensitive enough to perceive our presence during the initial contact phase." "What do you want?" I finally managed to whisper, my voice coming out as a harsh croak. The figure smiled, and his smile was as wrong as everything else about him, too wide, showing too many teeth that were too white and too perfectly aligned. "We want to study you," he said simply. "You and your family. Your reactions, your behaviors, your emotional responses to stress and fear. You're part of an ongoing research project that began several months ago." "Research project?" I repeated, not understanding. "We've been observing human family units to better understand the dynamics of fear, anxiety, and protective behavior. Your family was selected based on certain criteria: isolation, predictable routines, and most importantly, the presence of an adolescent subject who might be particularly sensitive to our presence." He moved closer to my bed, and I could smell something strange emanating from him. Not exactly unpleasant, but artificial, like the smell of new plastic or freshly printed paper. "The messages on your bathroom mirror, the figures around your house, the break-in at your neighbor's property. all carefully designed stimuli to produce specific emotional and behavioral responses. We've been documenting everything: your stress levels, your family's defensive measures, your interactions with law enforcement, your attempts to rationalize experiences that don't fit your understanding of reality. I felt sick as the implications of what he was telling me began to sink in. You've been experimenting on us. Observing and documenting, he corrected. Though I suppose from your perspective, the distinction is irrelevant. The important thing is that the observation phase is now complete. We have gathered sufficient data about your family's response patterns. And now? His smile widened, becoming even more disturbing. Now we move to the final phase of the study. The phase where we determine how human family units respond to direct, unavoidable contact with stimuli that cannot be rationalized or explained away. As he spoke, I heard sounds from elsewhere in the house. Footsteps in the hallway, doors opening and closing, quiet voices speaking in that same artificial tone. The other figures I'd glimpsed around our property were inside now, moving through our home, approaching my parents' bedroom. My parents, I said, starting to get out of bed. Are being contacted by my colleagues, the figure said calmly. Please remain where you are, James. Any attempt to interfere with the process will be noted in our final report, but it will not change the outcome. I could hear my mother's voice from down the hall, high and frightened, asking questions that were answered by those same unnaturally perfect voices. My father was awake too, and I could hear him demanding to know who these people were and how they had gotten into our house. They won't be harmed, the figure in my room said, seeming to read my thoughts. Physical injury would contaminate the data we're collecting. We're simply documenting their responses to direct contact with phenomena that exist outside their conceptual framework. You're not human, I said, and it wasn't a question. Not in the way you understand the term, he agreed. We're researchers from what you might call an adjacent reality, a dimension that parallels yours, but operates according to different physical and logical principles. We've been studying human behavior for what you would consider several decades, though time functions differently in our realm. He moved to my bedroom window and looked out at our backyard, where the motion sensor lights were now illuminating several more figures standing on our property. They had the same artificial perfection, the same wrong proportions, and unnatural stillness. Your species fascinates us, he continued. The way you create elaborate belief systems to explain phenomena you don't understand, the way you develop emotional attachments that override rational decision-making, the way you respond to threats through a combination of flight, fight, and social cooperation behaviors. But direct observation is the only way to gather truly accurate data. From down the hall, I could hear my parents' voices becoming more agitated, more frightened. They were asking the same questions I had asked. What did these creatures want? Why were they in our house? What was going to happen to us? The study concludes tonight, the figure told me. We'll be documenting your family's final responses, and then we'll be returning to our own reality to analyze the complete data set. Your usefulness to us as research subjects will be at an end. And then what happens to us? He tilted his head, considering the question with clinical detachment. Nothing. You'll continue your lives as before, though you may find that some of your memories of these events become unclear over time. Most subjects find it easier to convince themselves that their experiences were dreams or hallucinations rather than accept the reality of what they've encountered. As he spoke, I heard my mother scream from the master bedroom, a sound of pure terror that cut through me like a knife. Without thinking, I jumped out of bed and ran for my bedroom door, but the figure moved with impossible speed to block my path. I cannot allow you to interfere with the final documentation phase, he said, and for the first time, there was something like emotion in his artificial voice, not anger or cruelty, but a kind of professional regret. That's when I heard Michael's voice from outside, shouting my name from our front yard. Somehow, in the middle of the night, my best friend had appeared at our house, and he was calling for me with desperate urgency. The figure at my bedroom door tilted his head, listening to Michael's voice with what appeared to be confusion. This was not anticipated, he said. The secondary subject should not be present during the final phase. I took advantage of his distraction to push past him and run down the hallway toward my parents' bedroom. What I saw there will haunt me for the rest of my life. My parents were sitting on their bed, surrounded by 3 more of the artificial figures, All of them speaking in those wrong, perfect voices, asking questions and recording responses with devices that looked like nothing I'd ever seen before, crystalline structures that pulsed with their own light and seemed to react to my parents' emotional states. But when I burst into the room, something unexpected happened. The figures all turned to look at me, and in that moment of distraction, my father lunged for one of their recording devices, grabbing it and throwing it against the wall where it shattered in an explosion of light and sound that was definitely not from this world. The reaction from the creatures was immediate and visceral. They all began speaking at once in voices that lost their artificial perfection and became something harsh and inhuman, a sound like static and breaking glass. The lights in the house began to flicker, and I could feel a pressure in the air that made my ears pop and my vision blur. Michael's voice from outside was getting closer, and I could hear him pounding on our front door, demanding to be let in. But the creatures were panicking now. Their carefully controlled study had been disrupted, their equipment damaged, their subjects no longer responding according to their predictions. That's when I realized something that changed everything. These creatures, whatever they were just as vulnerable to chaos and unpredictability as we were. They had expected us to be passive subjects in their study, but human nature, our capacity for sudden, irrational action, was something they couldn't fully account for or control. I grabbed my parents and we ran for the front door, pushing past the confused creatures and unlocking the deadbolt to let Michael inside. As soon as the four of us were together, something changed in the atmosphere of the house. The artificial creatures seemed to lose their cohesion, becoming less solid, less present, as if our combined human reality was too strong for them to maintain their existence in our dimension. "We have to leave," Michael said, and I could see in his eyes that he understood what was happening without needing any explanation. "Right now." We ran outside into the November night, and as we reached the street, I looked back at our house one last time. The windows were filled with that strange, pulsing light, and I could see the silhouettes of the creatures moving frantically through the rooms, but they seemed to be fading, becoming transparent, losing their ability to maintain their presence in our world. By morning, when we returned with the police, there was no trace of what had happened. No broken recording devices, no evidence that anyone had been in our house, no sign that anything unusual had occurred at all. But we knew the truth. And somehow Michael had known to come to our house at exactly the right moment, as if some part of him had remained connected to what was happening to us even after the initial incident 6 weeks ago. The creatures never returned. Whatever study they had been conducting, we had contaminated their data beyond repair. But sometimes, late at night, I still wonder about that adjacent reality they mentioned, and whether somewhere in a dimension that parallels ours, other researchers are still watching other families, documenting their fears, studying their responses to phenomena that exist outside human understanding. And sometimes, when I look in the bathroom mirror after a hot shower, I still check to make sure no messages have appeared in the fog. Because now I know that we are not alone in the universe, and that some of the things watching us from the spaces between worlds are not as benevolent as we might hope. But I also know that human nature, our unpredictability, our capacity for loyalty and sudden courage, our ability to disrupt even the most carefully controlled situations, is our greatest strength against forces that seek to study us or control us. The word hello never appeared on our mirror again, but I've never forgotten that first message and the warning that followed it. We've been waiting. Because somewhere, in realities adjacent to our own, I suspect they still are. I don't know where to start with this, but I feel like I have to get it out. I never thought something like this would happen to me, but here we are. The whole thing started about 2 months ago, and it hasn't stopped. It's hard to explain why I didn't think much of it at first, but looking back, I really should have taken it more seriously. The house had always been quiet. Too quiet, some might say. I'd moved to this neighborhood specifically for the isolation, a single-story ranch at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by tall oak trees that blocked most of the streetlights. The nearest neighbor was Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down and kept to herself. Perfect for someone like me who worked from home and valued privacy above all else. It started with the knocking. I was in bed, just trying to get some sleep, when I heard it for the first time. The sound cut through the silence like a blade through silk, sharp and deliberate. 3 knocks. Not loud, but distinct, like someone was tapping on the door with something metal. The sound had an odd resonance to it, as if the person knocking was wearing rings or had coins between their knuckles. Each knock was perfectly spaced, exactly 2 seconds apart, with an almost musical quality that made my skin crawl in a way I couldn't explain. It woke me up, but I didn't think anything of it. Sometimes people knock on doors at weird hours, especially if they're drunk or confused. I figured it was someone who had gotten the wrong house. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed 2:33 a.m. in angry red numbers. I looked out the window, pressing my face against the cool glass and peering through the gap in the curtains. The porch light cast a sickly yellow circle on the concrete, but I saw nothing. No car in the driveway, no figure retreating down the street, just empty darkness beyond the light's reach. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Something about those knocks felt wrong, though I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe it was the precision of them, or the way they seemed to echo in my bones long after the sound had faded. I tossed and turned until dawn, listening to the house settle around me with its usual creaks and sighs. The next night, it happened again. 3 knocks at exactly 2:33 a.m. This time, I was ready for it. I'd been lying awake since midnight, staring at the ceiling and dreading the sound. When it came, my heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat. The knock seemed louder this time, more insistent, and there was something different about the rhythm. Still 3 knocks, still 2 seconds apart. But now they had a hollow, echoing quality that made me think of coffin lids slamming shut. I didn't get up to check. I didn't want to go outside at that hour, especially if it was just some idiot messing around. It was probably some late-night wanderer with no real reason to knock, I told myself. Maybe a drunk looking for a friend, or someone having car trouble. The logical explanations felt thin and inadequate, but I clung to them like lifelines, so I ignored it, pulling the pillow over my head and trying to block out the sound. But even through the down and cotton, I could still hear it. That hollow metallic tapping that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The third night, it happened again. 3 knocks at exactly the same time, 2:33 a.m. The precision of it was what finally got to me. Not 2:32, not 2:34, exactly 2:33, down to the second. I remember getting up this time, my bare feet silent on the hardwood floor as I crept to the front door. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. I looked through the peephole, pressing my eye against the small glass lens. The fisheye view of my porch was distorted and wrong, stretching the familiar space into something alien. I didn't see anyone, but there was something on the porch. A small, dark shape near the door. It was too dark to make out clearly, and the porch light seemed dimmer than usual, as if something was blocking part of the bulb. I didn't feel like opening the door. Every instinct I had screamed against it, though I couldn't explain why. The rational part of my mind insisted it was just paranoia, but the primitive part, the part that had kept my ancestors alive in darker times, knew better. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. I thought it was weird, sure, but at that point I figured it was just some late-night prank. After all, what were the odds that someone would knock at the same time 3 nights in a row, right? The question haunted me as I returned to bed, but sleep eventually claimed me in restless, dream-filled fits. But then it kept happening, night after night. 3 knocks, 2:33 a.m. Sharp, precise, relentless. By the 5th night, I was a wreck. I'd taken to leaving all the lights on in the house, and I'd moved my mattress to the living room so I could keep an eye on both the front and back doors. The knocks were getting to me in ways I couldn't explain. They weren't just waking me up anymore. They were changing me, making me jumpy and paranoid during the day. I started feeling more and more unsettled. It was like whoever was doing it knew exactly what they were doing. This wasn't random. They were knocking at the same time every night, and there was an intentionality to it that made my skin crawl. It wasn't some drunk wanderer or confused neighbor. This was deliberate, calculated, ritualistic. Maybe it wasn't some drunk person at all. Maybe it was someone trying to mess with me, or worse, someone who was watching the house, learning my patterns, planning something. The thought made my mouth go dry and my hands shake. It was then that I decided I needed to figure out who it was. I couldn't keep waking up every night at 2:33 a.m., wondering if someone was going to knock on my door again. The sleep deprivation was affecting my work, my health, my sanity. I'd catch myself staring out windows during the day, searching the tree line for movement. I'd installed additional locks on the doors and windows, though I couldn't say exactly what I was afraid of. The knocking wasn't normal, and I knew it wasn't a coincidence. The precision was too perfect, the timing too exact. Someone was doing this on purpose, and I had to find out who. So I decided to get a security camera. If I was going to solve this mystery, I needed evidence. I needed to see what was happening on my porch at 2:33 a.m. The security camera installation took me all afternoon. I'd bought a high-end system from the electronics store in town, night vision, motion detection, the works. The salesperson, a kid named Michael who couldn't have been more than 20, had tried to sell me a whole home security package, but I only needed one camera. Just one, pointed directly at my front door. "You having trouble with package thieves?" he'd asked, and I'd nodded, not wanting to explain the real reason. How do you tell someone that you're being terrorized by the most polite intruder in history? I mounted the camera under the eaves of the porch roof, angling it to capture the entire front area. The night vision gave everything a ghostly green tint, but the image was crystal clear. I could make out individual leaves on the oak tree in my front yard, could read the numbers on the mailbox across the street. If someone was coming to my door, I'd see them. The first night I had the camera up, I was anxious, but oddly relieved. Finally, I'd get some answers. I wasn't sure what I would find, but I wanted to know. The not knowing was worse than any truth could be, or so I thought. I had a bad feeling in my gut, a churning anxiety that made it impossible to eat dinner. I tried to ignore it and went to bed early, leaving the camera on and the monitor set up on my nightstand. I could watch the feed in real time if I wanted to, but mostly I planned to review the footage in the morning. 2:33 a.m. came like clockwork. Sure enough, the knocks came, just like every other night. 3 sharp raps on the door, each one perfectly spaced. But this time, I was watching. I held my breath as I listened, my eyes fixed on the glowing green image on the monitor. The porch appeared empty, just like always. For a moment, I thought the camera might have malfunctioned, or that whoever was doing this had somehow avoided its view. Then I saw movement. But when I checked the footage the next morning in proper detail, what I saw made my blood run cold. I'd watched it happen live, but seeing it again in the harsh light of day made it so much worse. The video showed the porch clearly. At first, everything was normal, just the empty concrete slab and the dark outline of my front door. Then, at exactly 2:32:58 a.m., a figure stepped into frame. The person was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the camera's infrared light. But it was the face that made me gasp aloud. They were wearing a ski mask, not just any ski mask, but one that looked old and worn, with holes cut roughly around the eyes and mouth. The fabric hung loose in places, giving the impression of rotting skin. The figure moved with an odd gliding motion, as if their feet weren't quite touching the ground. They approached my door with deliberate slowness, and I could see their head turning from side to side, scanning the windows and corners of the porch. They were checking for observers, making sure they were alone. At exactly 2:33 a.m., they raised their right hand. I could see something metallic in their grip, rings or maybe coins, just as I'd suspected from the sound. They knocked 3 times. Rap, rap, rap. Each knock was deliberate and measured, and I could see the figure's head tilt slightly after each one, as if they were listening for a response from inside. The figure stayed completely still for a few moments after the last knock, and I found myself holding my breath, even though I was watching a recording. There was something deeply wrong about their posture, something inhuman. They stood too straight, their arms hanging at their sides in a way that reminded me of a mannequin. Then, in an instant, they moved. The figure stepped back from the door and turned their head directly toward the camera. Even through the night vision's green tint, I could see eyes glittering in the holes of the ski mask. They stared directly at the lens for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. And then they ran. But this wasn't a normal run. It was something else entirely. The figure sprinted off the porch with inhuman speed, their movements fluid and wrong. They covered the distance from my porch to the tree line in seconds, moving faster than should have been possible. At the edge of the camera's range, they simply vanished into the darkness between the trees. I was frozen in place after watching that. My hands shook as I reached for my coffee cup, and the liquid sloshed over the rim onto my kitchen table. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to ask. What was he doing? Why was he knocking on my door at exactly the same time every night? It didn't make any sense. This wasn't a prank anymore. Pranks didn't require ski masks and superhuman speed. Whoever this was, they knew exactly what they were doing. And worse, they knew I was home. They'd looked right at my camera, right at me through the lens. I didn't sleep that day, despite my exhaustion. I stayed up, watching the footage over and over, trying to figure out who this person was and why they were terrorizing me. I zoomed in on every frame, looking for identifying details. Clothing brands, distinctive features, anything that might give me a clue. But the more I watched, the more disturbed I became. There was something about the figures' movements that bothered me, something that didn't look quite human. The way they held themselves, the way they moved, it reminded me of a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? Hey, someone knocks on my door every night at 2:33 a.m. and I think they're wearing a ski mask? They'd probably think I was crazy or worse, that I was wasting their time with paranoid delusions. But the fact that the person kept coming back night after night had me convinced they were trying to scare me. And it was working. I found myself jumping at every sound during the day, spinning around whenever I caught movement in my peripheral vision. The isolation I'd once treasured now felt like vulnerability. The next few nights, I decided I'd be ready. I wasn't going to just sit there and wait for it to happen again. I set up another camera, this time inside by the door, angled to capture anyone who might try to break in. I also kept a baseball bat near the door, one of the few sports equipment pieces I owned, a relic from a brief attempt at exercise years ago. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but I wasn't taking any chances. The figure in the ski mask had proven they were real, and they were focused on me specifically. But why? What did they want? The following night, I heard the familiar knocks, 3 sharp raps right at 2:33 a.m. This time, I was ready. I had both camera feeds up on my laptop, watching the outside and inside simultaneously. I saw the figure in the ski mask again. They performed the same ritual, the approach, the scanning, the 3 precise knocks. But this time, something was different. After they knocked, instead of staring at the camera and running away, they pressed their face against my door. I could hear them breathing through the wood, deep, ragged breaths that fogged the glass in the door's window. They stayed there for nearly a minute, just breathing and listening. Then I heard something that made my skin crawl. They whispered something. I couldn't make out the words through the door, but the sound was low and urgent, like an incantation or prayer. Then, just like before, they turned and sprinted off the porch at impossible speed. But this time, I did something I hadn't done before. This time, I opened the door. I wasn't expecting anyone to still be there when I opened the door, but I thought maybe I could catch a glimpse of whoever was doing this. Maybe I'd see something that would give me a clue. A license plate, a distinctive piece of clothing, anything. The night air hit me like a cold slap, carrying with it the scent of decaying leaves and something else, something organic and wrong. The porch light flickered, casting dancing shadows that made everything look alive and menacing. I looked around, but there was no one visible. The street was empty, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of distant streetlights. But something was different about the porch. Where the figure had been standing, the concrete was stained. Dark spots, roughly the size of footprints, marked the path from the steps to my door. The stains looked wet, but when I touched one with the toe of my shoe, it was dry and flaky. It crumbled away like ash, leaving behind a smell that reminded me of burnt hair. I stood there for several minutes, just looking out into the dark. I could feel eyes on me, that prickly sensation you get when someone's watching you from behind. But when I turned around, scanning the tree line and the shadows between houses, I saw nothing. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of power lines and the occasional rustle of leaves. But underneath those normal sounds, there was something else. A low, almost subsonic humming that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It made my teeth ache and my vision blur slightly. I finally went back inside, locking and double-locking the door behind me. The next morning, I reviewed the footage from both cameras again, hoping I'd missed something important during the live viewing. That's when I saw something that made my blood run cold. This time, after the figure sprinted off the porch, they didn't just disappear into the tree line. I could track their movement through the shadows, and what I saw defied everything I thought I knew about my situation. The figure ran directly to a cluster of oak trees at the corner of my property, about 50 yards from the house. But they didn't stop there. Instead, they joined two other figures who had been waiting in the shadows. 3 people total, all wearing identical ski masks, all standing perfectly still among the trees. They were positioned in a triangle formation, with each person facing a different direction, one toward my house, one toward the street, and one toward the back of my property. They were covering all the angles, making sure nothing could approach without being seen. I felt sick to my stomach. This wasn't just one person playing pranks or trying to scare me. This was organized, coordinated. They were working together, and they'd been watching my house from multiple angles while I'd been focused on just the front door. How long had they been there? How many nights had I gone to sleep thinking I was alone while 3 masked figures stood guard in my yard? The thought made my hands shake as I rewound the footage and watched it again. The 3 figures stood motionless for nearly 10 minutes after the knocking stopped. They didn't talk to each other or signal. They just waited, like sentries or guards. Finally, as if responding to some invisible signal, they all turned and walked deeper into the trees, disappearing into the darkness beyond the camera's range. I called the police that afternoon. I didn't care how it sounded anymore. I had the footage. I had proof. Multiple people in masks were trespassing on my property, and they were clearly up to something sinister. The dispatcher sounded skeptical at first. "Sir, did they actually threaten you or try to enter your home?" "No, but did they damage any property or attempt to steal anything?" "Not exactly, but they're clearly watching my house. They're organized. There are 3 of them, and they're wearing masks, and—" "Sir, I understand you're concerned, but without any actual crime being committed, there's not much we can do. Have you considered that this might be teenagers playing pranks?" Teenagers. Right. Teenagers who moved with inhuman speed and coordination, who left ash-like footprints and breathed whispers through doors. I tried to explain about the footage, about the precision of their movements and the military-like coordination, but the dispatcher just took down my information and promised to have an officer swing by. 2 hours later, Detective Samuel Harrison arrived at my door. He was a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes, the kind of cop who'd seen enough genuine crime to be skeptical of ghost stories. But he listened politely as I explained the situation and showed him the camera footage. His expression changed as he watched the recordings. The skepticism faded from his eyes, replaced by something I couldn't quite identify. Concern, maybe, or recognition. "Have you seen anything like this before?" I asked. Detective Harrison was quiet for a long moment, studying the frozen image of the 3 figures in the trees. "Not exactly like this," he said finally. "But there have been some reports. Other neighborhoods, similar situations. People reporting groups of masked individuals conducting what appears to be surveillance." "Other people? This has happened to other people?" He nodded grimly. 3 reports in the past 6 months. All single individuals living alone, all in isolated houses. The pattern is always the same, nighttime visits precisely timed, multiple observers. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. In 2 of the cases, the activity stopped after the homeowners reported it to us. "And the 3rd case?" Harrison's jaw tightened. "The homeowner disappeared. We found no signs of a struggle, no forced entry. They were just gone, along with some of their personal belongings." The room felt suddenly cold. "What kind of belongings?" "Photos, personal documents, items with sentimental value. Things you'd take if you were planning to start a new life somewhere else, but—" He shook his head. "The family insisted they would never have left voluntarily. They had no financial troubles, no personal problems, no reason to disappear." We spent another hour going through my footage in detail. Harrison took copies of everything and promised to increase patrols in my neighborhood. He also gave me his direct number and told me to call immediately if anything else happened. "In the meantime," he said, "consider staying somewhere else for a few nights. With family or friends, maybe. Just until we can figure out what we're dealing with." But I couldn't leave. This was my house, my sanctuary. I wasn't going to be driven out by masked strangers, no matter how organized or frightening they were. Besides, where would I go? I had no close family in the area, and my few friends were casual acquaintances at best. That night I prepared differently. I set up additional cameras around the perimeter of my property, borrowed from the security system at my office. I positioned them to capture the tree line, the backyard, and the sides of the house. If the watchers were going to observe me, I was going to observe them right back. I also called my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. She was a light sleeper and had lived in the neighborhood for decades. If anyone had noticed unusual activity, it would be her. "Oh, honey," she said when I described what had been happening. "I've been seeing strange things for weeks now. People walking around at all hours, always in dark clothes. I thought they might be burglars, so I've been keeping my curtains drawn and my doors extra locked." "Why didn't you call the police?" "What was I going to tell them? That I saw people walking down the street. That's not illegal." She paused. "But now that you mention it, they did seem to spend a lot of time near your house. Always around 2:30 in the morning, just like you said." Mrs. Patterson agreed to keep watch from her bedroom window, which had a clear view of my property. We arranged a system. If she saw anything unusual, she'd call both me and the police immediately. As night approached, I felt a mixture of dread and determination. I'd done everything I could to prepare. Now all I had to do was wait and see what the watchers would do next. At 2:33 a.m. exactly, they came again, but this time everything was different. The knocking came as expected. 3 precise raps that seemed to echo through the house with unnatural resonance. But tonight, my expanded camera system revealed the true scope of what I was dealing with. They weren't just 3 figures anymore. My perimeter cameras showed 7 masked individuals emerging from different directions, moving through the darkness with that same inhuman coordination I'd observed before. They approached my property like a military unit executing a planned operation, each person taking a predetermined position around my house. 2 positioned themselves at the front corners of my property, giving them clear sight lines to my front door and windows. 2 more took positions at the back corners, covering my rear exit and the sliding door to my patio. 1 stood at each side of the house, near the windows to my bedroom and office. And the 7th, the one I'd seen before, the one who did the knocking, approached my front door. They moved in perfect synchronization, reaching their positions at exactly the same moment. It was like watching a choreographed dance, except the dancers were nightmare figures in rotting ski masks. The knocker performed their ritual as usual, 3 sharp raps with whatever metallic object they carried. But this time, the other 6 began their own ritual simultaneously. I watched in growing horror as they all produced identical objects from their pockets. Small, metallic items that glinted in the infrared light. They began tapping against my house in unison, not loud enough to wake the neighbors, but clearly audible through my walls. The sound was rhythmic and hypnotic, like a heartbeat or a death march. Tap, 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 pause. Tap, 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 pause. Over and over, creating a symphony of menace that seemed to resonate in my bones. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what they did next. One by one, they began to remove their masks. The camera quality wasn't perfect, especially in night vision mode, but I could see enough to know that what was underneath the masks wasn't entirely human. Their faces were pale to the point of being luminescent, with dark hollows where their eyes should be. Their mouths were wrong somehow, too wide, with lips that were either black or simply absent. And they were all identical, not similar, not related, identical. 7 perfect copies of the same impossible face, staring at my house with those hollow eye sockets. I grabbed my phone with trembling hands and called Detective Harrison's direct number. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice thick with sleep. "Harrison here." "Detective, this is about the masked figures. They're here now, and there are 7 of them, and you need to see this because—" "Slow down. 7 of them? Are you sure?" "I'm watching them right now on my security cameras. They've surrounded my house, and, Detective, I don't think they're human. Their faces—" The line went dead. I stared at my phone in disbelief. The screen showed no signal, no bars at all. That was impossible. I had excellent cell coverage in this area, and the phone had been working perfectly moments before. I tried my landline. Nothing, just silence where the dial tone should have been. They'd cut my communications. Outside, the tapping continued. Tap, 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 pause, tap, 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 pause. The sound was getting into my head, making it hard to think clearly. I needed to do something, but what? 7 against 1, and I had no way to call for help. Then I remembered Mrs. Patterson. She was supposed to be watching, supposed to call the police if she saw anything. I looked toward her house through my front window, hoping to see lights on or some sign that she was aware of what was happening. Her house was dark, completely dark, even the porch light that she always left on. Either she was asleep and hadn't noticed the activity, or I didn't want to think about the alternatives. The tapping stopped abruptly, plunging my world into an eerie silence that was somehow worse than the rhythmic sounds had been. I checked my camera feeds and felt my heart skip a beat. All 7 figures were now facing my house directly, staring at the walls as if they could see right through them. As if they could see me. Then, moving in perfect unison, they all took a step forward. I grabbed the baseball bat from beside my door and backed away from the windows. Every instinct told me to run, to get out of the house immediately, but they had me surrounded. There was nowhere to go. Another step forward, all 7 moving as one. The tapping began again, but now it was coming from all around the house. They were striking the walls, the windows, the doors, creating a percussion symphony that vibrated through the floorboards and up into my bones. The sound was deafening and hypnotic, making my vision blur and my hands shake. I could hear things over the tapping, whispers maybe, or breathing. It sounded like voices chanting in a language I didn't recognize, the words blending together into an inhuman drone that made my teeth ache. Another step forward. Now they were close enough to touch my house. I ran to my bedroom, thinking I might be able to barricade myself in and wait for dawn, but as I passed the window, I made the mistake of looking out. One of them was pressed against the glass, their face inches from mine with only the thin barrier of the window between us. Up close, the wrongness of their features was even more apparent. Their skin had a waxy, translucent quality, like melted plastic that had been poorly reformed. The dark hollows of their eyes weren't empty. There was something moving in them, something that writhed and shifted like living shadow. Their mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing not teeth but a black void that seemed to extend far deeper than their throat should allow. They were trying to say something, their lips moving in exaggerated motions, but the only sound was a wet, clicking noise that reminded me of insects. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet and falling hard onto my bedroom floor. The baseball bat clattered away across the hardwood. When I looked back at the window, the figure was gone. The tapping stopped again, and the sudden silence was deafening. I crawled to the window and peered out carefully. The yard appeared empty, no sign of the 7 watchers. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope that they had left, that whatever sick game they were playing was over. Then I heard it, the sound of my front door opening. I hadn't heard them pick the lock or break down the door. I hadn't heard anything except the soft squeak of hinges that I'd been meaning to oil for months. They had opened my front door as easily as if they'd had a key. The house fell into a silence so complete it seemed to press against my eardrums. No footsteps, no breathing, no whispers, just the oppressive quiet of something unnatural holding its breath. I lay on my bedroom floor, my heart hammering so loudly I was sure they could hear it. The baseball bat was just out of reach, lying near the foot of my bed. Moving to get it would mean making noise, and some primal part of my brain insisted that noise meant death. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Time had lost all meaning in the suffocating darkness of my bedroom. I strained my ears for any sound that might tell me where they were or what they wanted, but the house remained unnaturally silent. Then I heard my own voice. It was coming from the living room, clear as day. "Hello? Is someone there?" The words I'd spoken into the darkness 3 nights ago, when I'd first thought to check the door. But how was that possible? The answer came in the form of more voices, my voice, repeated over and over in a dozen different inflections and contexts. Fragments of phone conversations, words I'd spoken to myself while working, even things I'd whispered in my sleep. They had been recording me, collecting pieces of my voice like trophies. But why? "Detective Harrison," my voice said from the living room, but wrong somehow, distorted. "This is about the masked figures. They're here now, and there are 7 of them." It was the call I'd made less than an hour ago, but played back in a sing-song tone that made my skin crawl. They were mocking me, or maybe they were trying to tell me something. I forced myself to move, crawling silently across the floor toward my bedroom door. I had to know what they were doing, had to see what I was dealing with. The door was slightly ajar, giving me a narrow view of the hallway that led to the living room. One of them stood in the hallway, its back to me. Without the ski mask, I could see that its head was perfectly bald and elongated, tapering to an unnatural point at the crown. Its skin had that same waxy, translucent quality I'd observed through the window, and I could see dark veins pulsing beneath the surface. As I watched, it tilted its head to one side, then the other, like a dog listening to a distant sound. The movement was too fluid, too extreme. Its head rotated nearly 90 degrees before snapping back to center with a soft clicking noise. "Help!" my voice said from somewhere deeper in the house. "Please help me." But I'd never spoken those words, at least not in the context they were using. They were constructing sentences from fragments, building conversations I'd never had. The figure in the hallway began to move, and I saw something that made me bite my tongue to keep from crying out. It wasn't walking, its feet didn't touch the floor. Instead, it glided forward with smooth, impossible motion, like it was floating on invisible currents of air. More of my voice drifted from the living room. "I don't understand what's happening. Please, just leave me alone." The words were desperate, pleading, but I'd never said them. They were creating dialogue, scripting a conversation that hadn't happened yet. Or maybe it had happened in some other house to some other victim whose voice they'd stolen and collected and used until there was nothing left. I thought about the missing homeowner Detective Harrison had mentioned. Had they done this to him too? Had they surrounded his house, recorded his voice, played it back in twisted variations before finally taking him away? The realization hit me like a physical blow. They weren't just watching me, they were studying me, learning my patterns, my voice, my habits. They were preparing to replace me, to take my place in the world using the fragments of identity they'd stolen. But why the elaborate ritual? Why the precise timing, the knocking, the theatrical surveillance? If they could simply take people, why all the ceremony? The answer came to me in a moment of horrible clarity. They were savoring it. This wasn't just about acquisition. It was about the hunt, the stalking, the gradual erosion of their victim's sanity. They fed on fear the way predators fed on prey, and I had been feeding them for weeks. My voice spoke again from the living room, but this time the words chilled me to my core. "I know you're listening. I know you're watching. I'm ready now." I had never said those words, which meant they weren't just playing back recordings anymore. They were creating new dialogue, putting words in my mouth that I'd never spoken. They were learning to be me. I had to get out of the house. Whatever these things were, whatever they wanted, I couldn't let them complete their grotesque process. I crawled backward toward my bedroom window, moving as slowly and silently as possible. The window was old and painted shut, but I'd loosened it months ago when the air conditioning had broken. It should open with enough pressure, though not without making noise. I'd have one chance to get it right. As I reached for the window latch, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Real footsteps this time, not the gliding motion I'd observed before. Someone was walking with deliberate heaviness, making sure I could hear them coming. "I know you're in there," my voice called from just outside my bedroom door. "There's no point in hiding." The doorknob turned slowly. I lunged for the window, throwing all my weight against the frame. It held for a heart-stopping moment, then gave way with a crack that sounded like a gunshot in the silence. Cold night air rushed into the room as I tumbled through the opening, landing hard on the strip of grass beneath my bedroom window. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I ignored it and scrambled to my feet. The backyard was empty, but I could see movement in the house. Pale figures gliding past the windows, searching for me with their hollow, writhing eyes. I had maybe seconds before they realized I'd escaped. I ran for the tree line, the same trees where I'd first seen them waiting in formation. Branches tore at my clothes and face, but I pushed deeper into the woods, guided only by starlight and the desperate need to put distance between myself and my house. Behind me, I could hear them emerging from the building. Not through the window I'd used, apparently they were too large or too inhuman for that, but through doors and other openings. Their voices rose in a chorus of distorted calls, all using my words, my inflections, creating a symphony of stolen identity. "Come back," they sang in my voice. "Don't leave us. We're not finished yet." I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. finally collapsing against a massive oak tree deep in the woods. The voices had faded, but I could still feel their presence like a weight on my back, a constant pressure that told me the hunt was far from over. As dawn broke through the canopy above, I realized the horrible truth. They hadn't just been preparing to replace me. They had been preparing to become me, to steal not just my identity, but my very existence. And somewhere in the growing light, I understood that Detective Harrison had been right about one thing. In the other cases, the activity had stopped after the homeowners reported it. But not because the watchers had been scared away. It was because their work was complete. Now, as I write this story in a coffee shop 3 towns over, I can see my reflection in the window beside me. But sometimes, just for a moment, the reflection moves independently. Sometimes it turns to look at me with hollow eyes that writhe with living shadow. Sometimes it smiles with my face, but with teeth that are too white and too sharp. I don't think I escaped after all. I think they let me go, knowing that wherever I run, I'll be taking them with me. The voices I hear aren't coming from outside anymore. They're coming from inside my own head, using my own thoughts, my own memories. They're not watching me anymore. They are me. And late at night, when I catch myself knocking on doors at exactly 2:33 a.m., I wonder who will be next. Who will hear 3 precise knocks in the darkness and make the mistake of trying to find out what they mean? I hope for their sake that they don't have security cameras, because some things are better left unseen. The house felt wrong the moment they all left. I stood at the front window, watching my mom's silver Honda disappear around the corner with my younger brother buckled safely in the back seat. The red brake lights flickered once before vanishing entirely, leaving me with nothing but the dying afternoon light and the strange, hollow sensation that our 2-story colonial had somehow expanded in their absence, as if the walls had inhaled deeply and forgotten how to breathe out. It was Friday, October 13th. I should have paid attention to that detail, should have recognized it as an omen. But I was 12, and the prospect of having the entire house to myself felt like Christmas morning wrapped in summer vacation. Dad had left that morning for a work conference in Chicago, his travel bag slung over one shoulder as he kissed Mom goodbye and reminded me to be the man of the house while he was gone. The phrase had made me stand a little straighter, chest puffed with temporary pride. My sister had departed even earlier, practically skipping out the door with her overnight bag stuffed with secrets and giggles, bound for her best friend's house where they would undoubtedly stay up until dawn, talking about boys and painting their nails colors that would make our parents wince. She was 15 and existed in that mysterious realm between childhood and adulthood, a place that seemed equal parts terrifying and wonderful from my distant vantage point. And then there was me, left behind like forgotten luggage. But I wasn't bitter about missing my brother's birthday party. I barely knew the kid whose party it was anyway, some classmate of his from the 3rd grade with a shrill laugh and sticky fingers who always seemed to be wiping his nose on his sleeve. Mom had gone along to help the birthday boy's mother with the chaos of entertaining a dozen sugar-fueled 8-year-olds. I'd been invited technically, but the thought of spending my Friday evening watching little kids play musical chairs and fight over party favors held about as much appeal as a root canal. No, I was perfectly content with my solitary evening. I had plans, leftover pizza from last night, my PlayStation, and maybe staying up late enough to catch the horror movie marathon on cable that Mom would never let me watch if she were home. The house was mine, a kingdom of creaking floorboards and familiar shadows, and I was its temporary ruler. Our house was nothing special, really. A standard suburban colonial built sometime in the 1970s, with beige siding and brown shutters that gave it the appearance of a cardboard box left too long in the rain. The layout was simple: kitchen, dining room, and living room downstairs, with all 3 bedrooms and the single bathroom upstairs. The basement was unfinished, a concrete tomb filled with Dad's woodworking tools, Mom's exercise equipment that doubled as an expensive clothes rack, and boxes of Christmas decorations that spent 11 months of every year slumbering in the dark. But as I stood there in the gathering dusk, the house felt different, larger. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more substantive, as if they were made of something thicker than mere absence of light. The familiar sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the old wooden frame, the distant whisper of wind through the eaves, had taken on an edge, a discordant quality that made the hair on my arms rise like tiny antennae seeking danger in the atmosphere. I shook off the feeling and headed for the kitchen. By the time I managed to figure out how to work the oven, Mom's handwritten instructions were surprisingly complex for something as simple as heating up a frozen pizza. The sun had disappeared behind the neighbor's oak tree, leaving the windows dark as blind eyes. The pizza, pepperoni and sausage, my favorite, smelled amazing as it cooked, filling the kitchen with the comforting aroma of melted cheese and processed meat. While I waited, I wandered through the downstairs rooms, flicking on lights as I went. Each illuminated space pushed back the encroaching darkness, but somehow the shadows seemed to retreat rather than disappear, pooling just beyond the reach of the warm yellow bulbs like living things seeking shelter. The house creaked and groaned around me, settling into its nighttime rhythm with a series of small pops and sighs that sounded almost like breathing. When the timer finally chimed, I retrieved my dinner and carried it into the living room on Mom's good china, a small rebellion that felt deliciously transgressive. I'd set up camp in Dad's recliner, positioned directly in front of our old tube television, with my PlayStation controllers within easy reach. The chair still smelled like his cologne and the peppermint gum he was always chewing, a combination that usually comforted me, but tonight seemed to emphasize his absence. I powered up the PlayStation and loaded my favorite game, a racing simulator that let me drive impossibly fast cars through impossibly dangerous courses. The familiar electronic music and sound effects filled the living room, drowning out the house's settling sounds and creating a cocoon of normalcy. For the first hour or so, I managed to lose myself in the game, forgetting about empty bedrooms and deep shadows and the strange weight of solitude that seemed to press against the windows like fog. But as the evening wore on, a persistent unease began to gnaw at the edges of my concentration. It started small, a missed turn here, a fumbled button press there, but gradually grew into something harder to ignore. The game that usually held my attention for hours felt flat, mechanical, like I was going through the motions while some deeper part of my brain remained alert, listening, waiting for something I couldn't name. By 9 o'clock, I'd died 3 times in a row, on a track I could usually navigate blindfolded. The pizza sat half-eaten on the plate beside me, the cheese congealed into unappetizing rubber. I paused the game and sat back in the chair, suddenly aware of how quiet the house had become. Even the settling sounds had stopped, leaving a silence so complete it felt solid, pressing against my eardrums like water. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the windows and sending something, a trash can maybe, or a loose shutter, banging rhythmically against the side of the house. The sound was irregular, arrhythmic, like a heartbeat with a murmur. I counted the beats. Bang, 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 bang. It should have been annoying, but instead it felt almost companionable, a reminder that there was still a world beyond these walls, still movement and life in the darkness beyond the glass. That's when I heard the footstep. The sound came from the front porch, a single deliberate creak of the old wooden boards that had been loose for as long as I could remember. During the day, those boards protested under the weight of delivery drivers, neighbors, and family members with a familiar groan that had become part of the house's personality. But this creak was different, heavier, more purposeful. I hit the mute button on the television remote and sat perfectly still, every muscle in my body tense as a coiled spring. The sudden absence of sound from the game made the silence feel even more oppressive, broken only by the distant banging and my own heartbeat, which seemed loud enough to echo through the empty rooms. Seconds ticked by. 5, 10, 15. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe the wind had shifted something on the porch. A potted plant or the old wooden chair Mom liked to sit in when she drank her morning coffee. Maybe, there it was again, creak, and then another, softer this time, as if someone was trying to move more quietly, someone who now realized they were being listened to. My mouth went dry. I set down the controller with exaggerated care, as if the person outside might somehow hear the plastic clicking against the wooden arm of the chair. Moving slowly, I rose from the recliner and crept toward the front window, keeping my body pressed low to avoid being silhouetted against the lit room. The living room window looked out onto our small front yard with its neat row of suburban shrubs and the concrete walkway that led from the sidewalk to our front door. During the day, it was as ordinary as any other yard on our street. Grass that needed cutting, a few flower beds that Mom tended with varying degrees of success, and the old oak tree that dropped leaves on everything from September through November. But now, in the uncertain light cast by the street lamps and the neighbors' porch lights, it looked different. Foreign. The familiar shapes of bushes and garden decorations had transformed into hunched figures and grasping arms. Every shadow could hide a threat. Every movement could be something more sinister than wind-blown branches. I pressed my face against the cool glass and peered out, my breath fogging the window in small puffs. The front porch was empty, no figure lurking by the door, no intruder caught in the act of... What? What had I thought I'd see? But the porch light was on, casting a yellow circle that barely reached the edge of the steps, and beyond that circle, the darkness was absolute. I strained my eyes, searching for movement in the shadows. The wind gusted again, sending dead leaves skittering across the walkway with a sound like fingernails on concrete. A cat, probably Mrs. Henderson's tabby from 2 houses down, darted across the yard, a fluid shadow that made my heart skip before I recognized it for what it was. Nothing. There was nothing there. I almost turned away, almost convinced myself that my imagination had gotten the better of me when I saw him. He was at the very edge of my vision, just beyond the effective reach of the streetlight, standing motionless next to our neighbor's mailbox. A man-shaped shadow in the greater darkness, so still he could have been a tree or a post if not for the subtle wrongness of his outline. Too angular for a natural feature, too purposeful in his positioning. I blinked hard, certain that when I opened my eyes he would be gone, revealed as nothing more than a trick of light and tired eyes. But when I looked again, he was still there, still watching. Because that's what he was doing, I realized with a cold certainty that seemed to seep through the window glass and into my bones. He was watching our house, watching me. Even from this distance I could feel the weight of his attention like a physical presence, pressing against the window, testing the barriers between the safety of inside and the unknown dangers of out there. I couldn't make out his features. The darkness and distance rendered him little more than a silhouette. But I could see that he was tall, and that he wore some kind of long coat or jacket that hung almost to his knees. He stood with the perfect stillness of someone accustomed to waiting, to watching, to cataloging the patterns of ordinary people living ordinary lives behind lighted windows. How long had he been there? The question hit me like a physical blow. How long had he been standing in the darkness, observing our house, learning our routines? Had he watched Dad leave this morning, waited for Mom and my brother to drive away, counted the minutes until my sister departed for her sleepover? Was this surveillance, preparation for something worse? I wanted to move away from the window, to call the police, to do something, but I found myself frozen in place, caught in what felt like a staring contest with a predator. If I moved too quickly, would he know I'd seen him? Would that knowledge trigger whatever he was planning? Or would looking away be an invitation, a sign that the coast was clear? The standoff lasted maybe 30 seconds, though it felt like hours. Then, with movements so fluid they seemed to blur at the edges, he turned and walked away. Not quickly, not like someone who'd been caught. Slowly, deliberately, like someone whose work was finished. He moved from shadow to shadow with practiced ease, staying just out of the direct reach of the streetlights until he disappeared around the corner where Mom's car had gone earlier. I remained at the window for another 5 minutes, scanning the visible portions of our yard and the street beyond. My hands were shaking, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. The normal sounds of evening had returned. Distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere, the muffled noise of a television from the house next door. But they felt muted, as if the world was holding its breath along with me. Finally, I forced myself to step back from the window. My legs felt weak, unsteady, and I had to grab the back of Dad's chair to keep from stumbling. This was insane. I was letting my imagination run wild, probably influenced by all those horror movies I'd been planning to watch. The man was probably just someone from the neighborhood out for an evening walk who'd happened to pause near our house. Maybe he'd been checking his phone, or looking for something he'd dropped, but I couldn't convince myself. There had been something too deliberate about his posture, too focused about the way he'd positioned himself. And the way he'd left, unhurried and methodical, suggested someone who'd accomplished exactly what he'd set out to do. I returned to the recliner, but the game held no appeal now. The electronic sounds that had been comforting before now seemed shrill and artificial, a thin veneer covering the deep quiet of an empty house being watched by unknown eyes. I turned off the PlayStation and sat in the sudden silence, every creak and settling sound magnified into potential threats. The banging from outside had stopped too, leaving only the whisper of wind through the trees and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Normal sounds, familiar sounds, but they felt hollow now, like a stage set designed to look normal while hiding something rotten underneath. I found myself thinking about locks. Our front door had a deadbolt, but what about the back door? I couldn't remember if Mom had locked it when she left. We rarely used the back door except for bringing groceries in from the car or letting the dog out. Except we didn't have a dog anymore, hadn't since Rusty died 2 years ago. The back door opened onto our small patio and the fenced backyard, protected from the street but also hidden from the view of neighbors. The thought made my stomach clench with sudden fear. If someone wanted to break into our house, the back door would be the logical choice. Private, shadowy, and, if I was remembering correctly, possibly unlocked. I had to check. I had to know. But first, I had to work up the courage to leave the relative safety of the living room and venture into the darker recesses of the house. The journey from the living room to the kitchen felt like crossing a minefield. Every step on the old hardwood floors seemed to echo through the empty house, announcing my position to anyone who might be listening. The familiar layout of our home had transformed in the darkness beyond the living room's circle of light. Doorways gaped like mouths, hallways stretched longer than I remembered, and corners harbored shadows deep enough to hide human shapes. I moved slowly, pausing at each doorway to listen for sounds that didn't belong. The dining room was a cavern of deeper darkness, its large window facing the side yard, creating a rectangle of slightly lesser black that might as well have been a portal to another dimension. Mom's china cabinet loomed against the far wall, its glass doors reflecting fragments of light from the living room in ways that made the dishes inside look like watching eyes. The kitchen lay beyond, and as I approached the threshold, I could see the pale glow of the microwave's digital clock casting its greenish light across the counter. 10:47 p.m. Later than I'd thought. The numbers seemed to pulse in the darkness like a heartbeat, counting down to some unknown deadline. I reached around the doorframe and flicked on the kitchen lights. The sudden brightness was both relief and alarm. Relief at banishing the shadows, alarm at how exposed the large windows made me feel. The kitchen had always been the heart of our home, warm with the lingering sense of home-cooked meals and morning coffee. But now it felt like a fishbowl, its windows offering clear views of my movements to anyone who might be watching from the darkness of our backyard. The back door stood against the far wall, its small window covered by sheer curtains that provided the illusion of privacy while offering no real concealment. As I approached, I could see the lock mechanism, a simple twist lock built into the door handle, and above it, the deadbolt that should have been engaged but wasn't. My heart sank. The deadbolt was unlocked, just as I'd feared. Mom must have forgotten to secure it when she'd rushed out with my brother. Or maybe she'd assumed Dad had locked it before leaving for his trip. Or maybe, and this thought chilled me, maybe someone had already been inside and unlocked it from within. I reached for the deadbolt, my hand trembling as I grasped the metal knob. The mechanism turned easily, too easily, sliding home with a soft click that seemed pathetically inadequate against whatever might be waiting in the darkness beyond. I tested the door handle next, confirming that it too was locked, though the flimsy construction of the door itself offered little real security. A determined person could probably kick it in without much trouble. That's when I heard it. A soft, testing rattle of the door handle from outside. I jerked my hand back as if the metal had become red hot. The sound came again, more insistent this time. Someone was trying the handle, checking to see if the door was locked, probing for weaknesses. The thin barrier of wood and glass between me and whoever was out there suddenly felt as substantial as tissue paper. My mind raced through possibilities. Call the police? But what if I was wrong? What if it was just the wind, or a raccoon, or the neighbor's cat? I'd look like an idiot, a scared kid jumping at shadows. But what if I was right? What if the man I'd seen in the front yard had circled around to the back, looking for easier access? The rattling stopped, followed by silence so complete that I could hear my own pulse thundering in my ears. I stood frozen in the middle of the kitchen, afraid to move toward the door, afraid to back away, afraid to do anything that might alert whatever was outside to my presence. Then came a sound that turned my blood to ice water, the slow, deliberate scrape of metal on metal. Someone was trying to pick the lock. This time I didn't hesitate. I lunged for the wall phone, an old rotary model that Mom kept for emergencies, claiming that landlines were more reliable than cell phones during power outages. My fingers fumbled with the receiver, nearly dropping it in my haste, and I had to dial my mom's cell number twice before getting it right. It rang once, twice, 3 times. Come on, I whispered, casting terrified glances at the back door. The scraping sound continued, methodical and patient, the sound of someone who knew what they were doing and had all the time in the world to do it. Hello? Mom's voice sounded distant and distracted, competing with background noise that sounded like screaming children and party music. Mom, I whispered urgently. Mom, someone's trying to break in. What? Honey, I can barely hear you. The party's really loud. Did you say something about someone's trying to get in through the back door? I hissed, louder this time. I can hear them picking the lock. The background noise on Mom's end suddenly muted, as if she'd moved to a quieter room. When she spoke again, her voice carried the sharp edge of fear and concern that I'd been hoping to hear. Are you sure? What exactly did you hear? Footsteps on the front porch, and then I saw a man watching the house from across the street. Now someone's at the back door trying to pick the lock. I can hear the metal scraping. Oh God. Okay, honey, listen to me. I want you to hang up and call 911 right now. Tell them what you told me. Then I want you to go upstairs to your bedroom and lock the door. Can you do that? The scraping sound stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt somehow more ominous than the noise had been. Mom, what if they get in before the police arrive? What if... They won't, she said firmly, though I could hear the tremor in her voice. The police will be there in just a few minutes. I'm leaving the party right now. I'll be home as soon as I can. The line went dead, leaving me alone with the dial tone and the terrible quiet from the back door. I hung up the phone and immediately dialed 911, my fingers moving automatically through the familiar sequence while my eyes remained fixed on the door that suddenly seemed as flimsy as cardboard. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's trying to break into my house, I said, proud of how steady my voice sounded. I'm home alone, and someone's trying to pick the lock on our back door. What's your address? I rattled off our street address, adding details about the attempted break-in and the man I'd seen watching the house. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, asking questions about the layout of our home and my current location. She told me that units were already en route and instructed me to stay on the line while moving to a secure location upstairs. But as I prepared to follow her instructions, a new sound froze me in place. The soft, unmistakable click of the back door lock disengaging. He was in. The sound of the lock giving way seemed to echo through the kitchen like a gunshot. I stood paralyzed for a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, the phone receiver clutched in my white-knuckled grip as my mind struggled to process what I'd just heard. The dispatcher's voice continued its calm litany of instructions, but the words seemed to reach me from very far away, as if she were speaking from the bottom of a deep well. I think he's inside, I whispered into the phone, the words barely audible even to myself. What was that? Are you still there? Before I could answer, I heard it. The soft creak of the back door opening, followed by the nearly inaudible whisper of footsteps on the kitchen linoleum. Someone was moving through our house with the careful, practiced steps of a predator navigating familiar territory. Terror shot through my nervous system like electricity, finally breaking the paralysis that had held me frozen. I dropped the phone, letting it dangle from its cord as the dispatcher's voice became a distant buzz of concern, and bolted from the kitchen toward the stairs. My sock-clad feet slipped on the hardwood floors as I took the corner too fast, catching myself against the wall before scrambling up the stairs 2 at a time. Behind me, I could hear the intruder moving through the first floor of our house, not rushing, not panicking, but methodically exploring the space as if taking inventory. Cabinet doors opened and closed softly. Drawers slid in and out with barely a whisper. Whatever he was looking for, he was searching for it with the patience of someone who believed he had all the time in the world. I reached the upstairs hallway and paused, gasping for breath and trying to decide which room offered the best refuge. My parents' bedroom had a lock on the door, but it also had large windows that faced the front yard, windows that would make me visible to anyone watching from outside. My sister's room faced the backyard, which felt too close to where the intruder had entered. That left my own room, at the end of the hall, with its single window facing the side yard and a door that locked from the inside. I crept down the hallway, avoiding the boards that I knew would creak under my weight. Knowledge gained from years of midnight trips to the bathroom and early morning attempts to sneak downstairs without waking my parents. The familiar route that had once been an adventure now felt like a life-or-death navigation exercise. My bedroom door stood slightly ajar, and I slipped through the gap before closing it as quietly as possible. The lock was a simple push-button mechanism built into the door handle. Hardly Fort Knox, but better than nothing. I engaged it with a soft click that sounded thunderous in the silence. The room that had been my sanctuary for as long as I could remember suddenly felt like a trap. Movie posters stared down at me from the walls with expressions that now seemed ominous rather than heroic. My collection of action figures, arranged on shelves around the room, looked like an audience of silent witnesses. The single window, which during the day provided a pleasant view of the neighbor's vegetable garden, now gaped like a blank eye that could hide any number of watching faces. I crawled across the floor to my bed, staying low to avoid being silhouetted against the window. The space between my bed and the wall had always been my private hideout, a narrow cave where I could retreat when the world became too much to handle. Now I wedged myself into that familiar space and pulled every blanket I could reach down over my trembling body, creating a cocoon of false security in the darkness. From downstairs came the sounds of continued searching, more careful than frantic, as if the intruder was cataloging our possessions rather than looking for something specific. I heard him move through the living room, testing the entertainment center, checking behind the television, then the dining room, where Mom's good china chimed softly as he examined the contents of the cabinet. Finally, what sounded like footsteps on the basement stairs, descending into the unfinished darkness below. Where were the police? How long did it take them to respond to a break-in? I tried to count the minutes since I'd made the call, but time had become elastic, stretching and compressing in ways that made no sense. It felt like hours since I'd heard the back door open, but logic suggested it had been only minutes. The house grew quiet again, so quiet that I could hear the electric hum of my alarm clock and the distant sound of traffic from the main road several blocks away. Had he left? Had he found whatever he was looking for and departed as silently as he'd arrived? Or was this the calm before something worse? I was still listening for sounds of movement when I heard it, the slow, deliberate creak of the stairs leading to the second floor. My blood turned to Arctic slush in my veins. He wasn't leaving. He was coming upstairs, to where I was hiding, to where any smart homeowner would have secured their most valuable possessions. Or maybe he wasn't interested in possessions at all. Maybe he'd known all along that there was a child in the house, a 12-year-old boy left alone and defenseless. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs and paused. I could picture him standing there in the hallway, orienting himself to the layout of the second floor, deciding which room to investigate first. Would he start with my parents' bedroom, drawn by its obvious importance? Or would he work methodically from one end of the hall to the other? A door opened, my parents' room, based on the direction of the sound. I heard him moving around inside, checking the closets, testing the dresser drawers, then silence, followed by the soft click of that door closing again. My sister's room was next, another door opening, more quiet footsteps, the whisper of hangers being moved aside in her closet. He was thorough, this intruder, leaving no space unexplored, which meant my room was next. I pressed deeper into the narrow space between my bed and the wall, pulling the blankets more tightly around myself, as if they could provide actual protection rather than merely the illusion of it. My breathing sounded impossibly loud in the confined space, and I tried to slow it, to quiet it, to become as small and invisible as possible. The footsteps approached my door and stopped. The handle turned softly, testing the lock. Finding it engaged, he rattled it gently, not trying to force it, just checking the mechanism. Then silence. I waited, every muscle in my body tense as a coiled spring, for the sound of him kicking in the door or throwing his shoulder against it. Instead, I heard something that chilled me far more deeply. The soft whisper of metal tools being removed from a pocket, followed by the familiar scraping sound of someone working on a lock. He'd already picked one lock tonight. A simple bedroom door wasn't going to slow him down for long. That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the distant wail of sirens growing louder as they approached our neighborhood. Multiple vehicles, by the sound of it, racing through the night toward our house. The cavalry was coming. The lock-picking sounds stopped immediately. I heard rapid footsteps moving away from my door back toward the stairs, then the sound of someone descending much faster than they'd climbed up. Moments later came the crash of the back door being flung open, followed by the sound of running feet across our patio and into the darkness of the backyard. The sirens were very close now, close enough that I could see the red and blue flashing lights painting the walls of my room in alternating colors. They pulled into our driveway with the growl of powerful engines and the slam of car doors. Heavy footsteps pounded up our front walkway, followed by authoritative pounding on the door. "Police! Anyone inside?" I crawled out from under the blankets, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. I made it to the window and looked down to see 3 patrol cars in our driveway, their light bars painting the entire front yard in emergency colors. Officers were moving around the perimeter of the house, flashlights sweeping through the darkness as they searched for signs of the intruder. "Up here!" I called through the window, my voice cracking with relief and residual terror. "I'm upstairs. He ran out the back when he heard the sirens." One of the officers looked up and waved, his flashlight beam finding my face in the window. "Are you hurt? Is anyone else in the house?" "Just me. I'm okay. He didn't get into my room." "Stay right where you are. We're coming up." I heard them enter through the back door, the same route the intruder had used, their heavy boots and radio chatter filling the house with reassuring sounds of authority and control. When they knocked on my bedroom door, identifying themselves as police, I had never been happier to hear anything in my life. The officer who entered was a tall, kind-faced man with graying temples and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He looked me over carefully, checking for injuries, before asking me to describe everything that had happened. As I told my story, his expression grew increasingly grim. "You did exactly right," he told me when I finished. "Calling 911, locking yourself in your room, staying hidden, that took real courage. Did you catch him?" He shook his head. "We're still searching the neighborhood, but he had a good head start. We found evidence that he'd been inside, though. Footprints in the kitchen, some items moved around downstairs, and you're right about the lock on the back door. It had definitely been picked. Professional job, too." The word professional sent a new chill through me. This hadn't been some desperate junkie looking for quick cash or electronics to pawn. This had been someone with skills, someone with experience, someone who'd done this before. "The good news," the officer continued, "is that he didn't get very far into the house and nothing appears to be missing. You scared him off before he could accomplish whatever he came here to do." But as I looked around my familiar bedroom, my private sanctuary that would never feel quite safe again, I realized that something had been taken after all, something precious and irreplaceable that I hadn't even known I possessed until it was gone. My sense of safety, my trust in locked doors and lighted windows, my belief that home was a place where monsters couldn't reach me. Those things had been stolen as surely as any television or jewelry, and unlike material possessions, I wasn't sure they could ever be replaced. The police stayed for nearly 2 hours, processing what they called the crime scene with a thoroughness that both impressed and unsettled me. They dusted for fingerprints on every surface the intruder might have touched, photographed the scratches he'd left on the back door lock, and collected samples of mud from the kitchen floor that had fallen from his shoes. Officer Bradley, the kind-faced man who'd been first into my room, explained each step of the process, treating me like a partner in the investigation rather than just a victim. "The good news," he said as his colleagues packed up their equipment, "is that this guy left more evidence than he probably intended. The bad news is that someone this skilled probably isn't a first-timer. We'll run the prints through the database, see if we get any hits." Mom arrived home while they were still working, screeching into the driveway with my brother asleep in the back seat and raw panic written across her face. I'd never seen her move so fast. taking the front steps 3 at a time before Officer Bradley intercepted her at the door to explain the situation. When she finally made it upstairs to where I was sitting on my bed, still wrapped in blankets and struggling to stop shaking, she gathered me into her arms with a fierceness that made my ribs ache. "I'm so sorry," she whispered into my hair. "I should never have left you alone. This is all my fault." "It's not your fault, Mom. How could you have known?" But even as I said it, I could see the guilt etching lines around her eyes, aging her in real time. She would carry this night with her, I realized. The knowledge that her decision to attend a child's birthday party had nearly cost her own child something far more precious than whatever the intruder had been seeking. Dad arrived 3 hours later, having driven through the night from Chicago after Mom's frantic phone call woke him in his hotel room. He looked haggard and wild-eyed, his usually perfect business attire rumpled from the hasty journey. He went through the same ritual as Mom, gathering me into his arms, checking for injuries that weren't there, apologizing for an absence that wasn't his fault. "We're getting a security system," he announced to the room at large. "First thing Monday morning, cameras, motion sensors, the works, and new locks, better locks." It was nearly 4 in the morning before the house fell quiet again. My sister had been collected from her sleepover, much to her disappointment and confusion, and the whole family had reassembled in the living room for what Dad called a debriefing, but felt more like group therapy. We talked through the evening's events again and again, as if repetition could somehow drain the poison from the memory. When I finally made it back to my room, I found that I couldn't sleep. Every sound, the settling of the house, the whisper of wind through the trees, the distant hum of traffic, sent adrenaline shooting through my system like electricity. My familiar sanctuary felt compromised, invaded, as if the intruder's presence had left some kind of psychic residue that couldn't be cleaned away with soap and water. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, playing the evening over and over in my mind, like a movie I couldn't turn off. What would have happened if the police had arrived 5 minutes later? What if he'd managed to pick the lock on my bedroom door? What if his intentions had been more sinister than simple burglary? The questions chased each other through my mind in endless loops, each one spawning new possibilities, new horrors, new reasons to lie awake, listening for sounds that didn't belong. When I finally drifted off near dawn, my dreams were filled with faceless figures moving through dark houses, testing locks, watching from shadows, always just out of sight, but never truly gone. The next few weeks passed in a haze of protective measures and nervous energy. True to his word, Dad had a security system installed, not just basic door and window sensors, but cameras, motion detectors, and a control panel that turned our modest suburban home into something resembling a fortress. The installation team, a duo of cheerful technicians in matching polo shirts, assured us that the system was top of the line and would keep out everything short of a SWAT team. But even with cameras watching every approach to the house and sensors monitoring every door and window, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. It started as a vague unease, a prickling between my shoulder blades when I walked home from school, a sense of eyes tracking my movements through the neighborhood. I found myself taking different routes, varying my schedule, looking over my shoulder with increasing frequency. Mom noticed first, commenting on how jumpy I'd become, how I seemed to startle at every unexpected sound. She suggested counseling, which I resisted with the stubborn pride of a 12-year-old who believed that admitting fear was the same as admitting weakness. Dad tried a different approach, teaching me basic self-defense moves and buying me a baseball bat to keep beside my bed, just in case. Neither approach addressed the core problem, the knowledge that our safe suburban world contained predators who moved through the darkness with professional skill and unknown intentions. School became a refuge, the one place where I could almost forget about the night that had changed everything. But even there, the paranoia followed me. I found myself studying faces in the hallways, wondering if the intruder might have children of his own, if he might be hiding in plain sight among the parents and teachers and visitors who moved through our building every day. Every maintenance worker, every substitute teacher, every unfamiliar adult became a potential threat to be cataloged and assessed. The worst part was the waiting. Officer Bradley called regularly with updates on the investigation, but the news was consistently disappointing. The fingerprints had yielded no matches in their database. The neighbors had seen nothing suspicious. The mud samples and other physical evidence painted a picture of someone who knew what he was doing but told them nothing about who he actually was. These kinds of cases are tough, Bradley admitted during one of his visits, accepting a cup of Mom's coffee while delivering another update that contained no actual progress. Professional burglars, especially ones who do this kind of reconnaissance work, tend to be careful about leaving trails. But the good news is that he probably won't be back. You've hardened the target too much. Too many cameras. Too much risk. He'll move on to easier prey. The phrase easier prey stuck with me long after the officer left. Somewhere out there, in another house, in another neighborhood, another family was living their normal life behind unlocked doors and unmonitored windows, unaware that someone might be watching, waiting, calculating the perfect time to turn their sense of safety into a memory. I started paying attention to crime reports in the local paper, scanning the brief summaries of break-ins and attempted burglaries for details that might match our experience. Most of them seemed random, desperate, kicked-in doors, smashed windows, the messy work of drug addicts and opportunists. But occasionally, I'd find something that made my skin crawl. A report of someone entering a home through a picked lock, searching methodically through personal belongings, leaving no trace beyond the violation of space and privacy. Was it the same person? Was he still out there, still working his way through our community like some kind of suburban predator? The police couldn't tell me, and even if they could, I wasn't sure the knowledge would make me feel better or worse. Months passed. The security system became part of our routine, armed each night and disarmed each morning with practiced efficiency. The cameras captured nothing more threatening than raccoons, delivery drivers, and the occasional neighborhood cat. Life gradually returned to something resembling normal, though normal now included motion sensor lights, reinforced door frames, and a level of vigilance that would have seemed paranoid just a year earlier. But I never forgot. Even now, years later, I can still recall every detail of that night with crystalline clarity. The sound of footsteps on the porch, the weight of being watched, the scrape of metal tools against our back door lock. I remember the feeling of being prey, of being hunted by something that moved through the darkness with intelligence and purpose. Most of all, I remember the lesson that night taught me, that the monsters aren't always imaginary, that some of them are human, and that they don't disappear when you turn on the lights. They just step back into the shadows, patient and careful, waiting for the next unlocked door, the next unguarded moment, the next opportunity to remind us that no lock is strong enough to keep out every kind of darkness. The man who broke into our house was never caught. Sometimes late at night, when the wind is rattling the windows and the security system's sensors are casting their invisible nets around my home, I wonder if he's still out there, still watching, still waiting, still hunting for houses where 12-year-old boys sit alone in the dark, believing they're safe. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Unfortunately, the channel is going through a tough time right now, and we really need your help to keep creating content that you love. If you can, please share our videos with your friends and family, and leave a comment to let us know what you think. Every little bit helps and keeps us motivated to bring you more great content. Thanks again for being part of our community, and we hope to see you in the next video.